thank you for that very, very warm and generous welcome. It's great to be with you guys. I wonder if I could begin this morning just by telling you about a funny thing that happened actually when we were on holiday as a family last month. I have made a point of always, every year of my life, swimming at least once off the coast of the British mainland. And I'm sure you know, because you live here too, what it's like on that week that you end up on holiday. It could well be rather bleak, rather wet, overcast. I mean, often quite cold. I'm sure you found this. And of course, what will often happen typically is that we will arrive. This is myself, my wife, and our 4 daughters, and we'll drive up and park at some bleak coastal town, and that my wife and girls are like huddling around the heater in the car. And of course, I've already committed previously. I'm going to swim, and I always swim. I just wear I don't have a wetsuit. I just wear my swimming shorts. And so sometimes one of our daughters will say, "Daddy, if you look out now, Daddy, you can see that no one else, Daddy, is swimming in the sea. Are you sure about this, Daddy?" And I'll turn around and say, "Don't you worry your pretty head about that. Daddy's seen far worse." And then, of course, I'll head out wearing my swimming shorts, and the waves are coming in. Maybe it's the North Sea, the kind of off the North Pole, the Arctic tundra is coming in, and I will walk confidently up. And what I do, there's none of this sort of none of that. Oh no. I'll walk in confidently, and I will adopt, as the first wave approaches, I will adopt a pose thus, a pose that in our family has come to be known as defying the elements. And as the first wave crashes against me, I'll remain unmoved like a granite rock, like that. And then I'll walk on another couple of yards, take up again the same defensive pose. And it's not just physical defiance of the elements. It's also, I'll have you know, verbal defiance. Because you see, as the second wave comes, I'll often taunt, I'll mock the elements. I'll say, "Ha! Is that all you've got?" And then I'll march on further. Now, that's what normally happens, but I have to confess to you, if I'm totally honest, that this year, folks, it was only really a very short time that I was in the sea, swimming in the sea. And as I hurried back out of the very cold sea, I did notice that there were 2 blokes who were still in when I left. And both of them were wearing wetsuits. And so I began to think that maybe now, at the age of 52, maybe the time has come. Maybe I can no longer defy the elements without that added layer of insulation. And so I have to confess to you that in a place, in a beach on the Pembrokeshire coast of Wales called Newgale, aptly named, I mark my words, in Newgale there was a wetsuit shop called the Surf Shack. And I entered the Surf Shack, I went to the back of the Surf Shack, and for the first time in my life, I tried on a wetsuit. I didn't buy the wetsuit. I didn't buy the wetsuit because it cost £179. But I tried on a wetsuit. And I thought, maybe there's only so long you can defy the elements. And I don't know whether you've found maybe there's an area in your life where you've begun to feel the same kind of thing. Maybe as you've gone through life, you've discovered some area of life where it's all just become too much. There are lots of reasons why we might be well advised to study the life of Moses. One of them is because even if you aren't facing a challenge at the moment, perhaps you think in the future there's a good chance I will face a big challenge. Maybe a challenge where it feels like there's no way forward. You see, for the Israelites, they're facing the Red Sea. They've got no way forward. Hey, there's only so much defying of the elements. That's not going to part the seas. Maybe you feel like Pharaoh's army are coming up behind you. You can hear the hooves and the chariots thundering down. I don't know whether you've ever felt like this. Maybe in your finances, there's no way forward. But meanwhile, you've still got the direct debits and the standing orders coming in behind you and the bills. There's British Gas, and you're between a rock and a hard place. Let's see what we can learn from Moses, because he faced this on an epic scale with Pharaoh's armies behind him and the Red Sea in front of him. Another reason why we might study the life of Moses is because there are some people in this room who are in danger of making a serious miscalculation. And it goes like this: well, Adrian, now I'm retired and I don't know, I've reached my 60s, my 70s, I'm reaching my late 70s. I think probably most of the big challenges of life are probably in my past, and now, You already know, you walked straight into the trap. Moses was 80. All that stuff, the first 80, it was all just trial and error preparation. The big stuff's yet to come. Isn't that encouraging? The big stuff is still to come. Aren't you so pleased? Another reason to study the life of Moses. Another reason why we might study the life of Moses is because actually it might do more than anything else to convince you that actually God wants to use people who don't think much of themselves. Because, of course, when the great moment comes, finally Moses is there with God. He hears from God. How cool is that to have a conversation with God? God tells Moses, this is what I want you to do. I want you to go before Pharaoh, and I want you to say these words, let my people go. That's what you're supposed to say. And then I'm sending you, Moses. Moses says in response, oh Lord, please send someone else. That's literally what he says. It's so true to life. This story is so true to life. Another reason to study the life of Moses is because you can be free. And I don't know what you're facing. I don't know what kind of adversity you're up against. Maybe it feels like slavery. But actually for these people, their parents had been slaves, their grandparents had been slaves, their great-grandparents, all they'd ever known for 400 years was slavery. And yet, even though there seemed to be no hope and no way forward, hey, God can do a miracle. When you feel the most stuck you've ever been, God can do a miracle. You can see the Red Sea part, and you can inherit the promises of God. You can be free. And so, why don't we consider our hero? When we meet our hero Moses, we find him in the wilderness. That's where he is, at the start of Exodus chapter 3 and verse 1. Folks, this was not Moses' ambition in life. He didn't want to think, oh, one day when I grow up, I want to live in the middle of nowhere, and I want to look after somebody else's sheep, and I want to lead them from one part of nowhere to the far side of nowhere. No, that wasn't his ambition in life. In fact, actually, Moses had rather good career prospects. Things were looking rather good for him. But folks, as we meet our hero here in chapter 3 and verse 1, it's all gone wrong. It's all gone wrong. He's tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness. Am I meeting you this morning and you are in the spiritual wilderness? Feels like all the exciting things that when I was younger I thought God would call me to do, now they haven't really happened. It's all been a bit disappointing. It's all been a bit underwhelming. It's all been a bit of a disappointment. Maybe that's where you're at. Maybe you're like Moses. You're not where you thought you'd be at this stage in your life. Actually, it feels like nothing is happening. You don't actually know what's going on. All the plans and promises of God that seem to be over your life haven't worked out, and now you're stuck. How did this guy get into this wilderness situation when his prospects had been so good as the prince of Egypt? Well, let's review the story so far as we begin our new series. Let's have a look at the first couple of chapters. Folks, as we turn to Exodus 1 and verse 1, if you look at the commentaries on the book of Exodus, they all start by saying, and of course, they all say, in the original Hebrew, the first word doesn't appear in your English translations because the first word in the original Hebrew is the word and. Now, I don't know about you, but when I went to school, I was taught never begin a sentence with the word and. But isn't it liberating to find that God does not obey the rules of English grammar? So you can throw off those shackles, all that stuff you heard in English language, GCSE and O-level, whatever. Forget it all. If God can begin a sentence with the word and, so can I. But why is that word and in there? Because the author of Exodus wants us to see that this is the continuation of a story that we've heard before. The story previously is the same story. It's the story of the book of Genesis. And if you're part of the Beacon Church, you may know that we spent a very long time following Jacob and his son Joseph all the way from Genesis 37 to Genesis chapter 50. It took us a very long time to do it. This is the continuation of that story, and actually that story was the continuation of a previous story at the beginning of the book of Exodus. It's all to do with a bloke called Abraham, who has this amazing promise over his life that his descendants will be as many as the stars in the sky and as many as the grains of sand on the shore. That's how many descendants he'll have. And look, by this stage, as we pick up the story in Exodus 1, there are 70 of them, 70 descendants. That's the running total. But things hot up, and they become exceedingly fruitful. There are many more than 70. In fact, the land is filled with them. And when a new king comes to power, who can't remember anything about Joseph, whoever he was, he says, look, there are so many of these people now. If we have a military conflict, who knows, maybe the Hebrews will turncoat and side and fight against us, fight for our enemies. So we've got to do something about this, Pharaoh says. So he put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. Now, actually, this verse is rather more important than you might think, because there is a debate going on at the moment about the date of the Exodus. And there's one group of Old Testament scholars who say, well, the Exodus happened in 1446 BC. And then there's another group of scholars who say, no, on the contrary, I think you're mistaken. The Exodus actually happened in 1260 BC. And that group of scholars pin their argument upon this verse, because they say that Ramses, which is a place that we know quite a lot about, there's been lots of archaeological work done at Ramses so we can identify that place. They say that Ramses, this city, is named after a pharaoh called Ramses, and we know where that Ramses lived. We know when he reigned, and that's the main reason why they argue for the later date, the 1260 date. But these slaves multiply and spread. They're worked ruthlessly, and eventually the king does something about it. He says to two Hebrew midwives whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, here's what I want you to do. As you're helping with the birth on the delivery stool, if it's a boy, kill the boy. If it's a girl, let her live. That's how we're going to keep the slave population to reasonable numbers. But what happens next is absolutely hilarious, because you see, these two Hebrew women, what they then say to Pharaoh, they come back to Pharaoh a few weeks later and say, oh, Pharaoh, we did understand the directive. We did understand what you were supposed to do. But, oh, Pharaoh, it's so difficult. These Hebrew women, they give birth so fast. I mean, honestly, Pharaoh, I've got my bag ready and I'm going there, and I know that the woman's in labor, but before I can even get there, I'm in the street with my bag. I can hear, wah, wah. She's given birth already. I was too late. And so then I hear that this other woman, Mrs. So-and-so, she's down the other end of the street. She's in labor as well. So I'm off with my bag. But before I can get there, wah, wah, these Hebrew women, they're popping out babies all over the shop. I just can't keep up. That's what they say. And I just wonder about these women. There's something about them that I just think is so amazing. I mean, this is the most powerful man on earth. His edict is, you are supposed to kill every Hebrew boy. And there's something within these women. And remember, they've had nothing much happening in their lives either. Remember, these people haven't heard from God for 400 years. Radio silence from heaven for 400 years. If you said to Shiphrah and Puah, what's God said to you recently? Oh, we haven't heard from God for 400 years. Nothing's going on. And yet still, these women rise up and they said, you know what? God's not doing anything in my life at the moment. I'm not hearing from God. It's all a bit same old. In fact, we're slaves. In fact, we've been told to kill the Hebrew babies. But you know what? I'm going to stand on the promise given to our ancestor Abraham hundreds of years ago that his descendants would be as many as the stars in the sky and as many as the grains of sand on the shore. And for that promise to come true, I can't be killing Hebrew babies. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to stand up. I'm going to trust God. I'm going to believe God. Amen. And I just wonder if there's one or two women in this room. And you're a bit like that. You're a bit like Shiphrah and Puah. I'm not going to wait for my circumstances to improve. I'm not going to wait for things to work out. I'm not going to wait for it to be a sunny day. I'm not waiting for things to turn up great. I'm going to believe God anyway. I'm going to trust God come what may. That's what these women did. And God honored them. So Pharaoh has to go to plan B. Plan B, every Hebrew boy gets drowned in the Nile. That's plan B. Well, there was a man of the tribe of Levi, we find out in chapter 6 that he's called Amram, and he marries a Levite woman. We find out in chapter 6 that she's called Jochebed, and she becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son. This is Moses. He's going to be called Moses, but I love the next bit. You see, folks, who is the author of the book of Exodus? It's Moses. And so Moses gets to write in the Bible. By the way, just as I'm recording the history, if you were wondering what kind of a baby I was, I think you'll find that I was a fine child. Let it be known once and for all. Look, it's still there now. Look, it's still there. He said he can actually write that he was a fine child. Just by the way. And anyway, so she tries to hide him for 3 months. It's really hard to hide a newborn baby. And so obviously, eventually she can hide him no longer. And so this is where the Moses basket comes in. Yeah, you know, eBay, the Moses baskets. This is where they come from. They come from here, verse 3. Now, there's 2 ways of looking at this story, what happens next. The first way, ladies and gentlemen, is the DreamWorks, Disney, Pixar, Prince of Egypt way of looking at what happens next. And according to the DreamWorks, Pixar, Disney version of events, what happens is, yes, she puts Moses in the Moses basket, and then the waves and the wind whip up, da 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 da, river, oh river, and she launches and then she trusts in the sovereignty of God. And what happens is that the basket is whipped up, and then there are some hippos who try and eat Moses. I mean, how bizarre is that? And then the baby escapes from the hippos, and then there's this. There's some rowing boats, and they're fishing, and so the Moses basket is caught up, but then it trips over. Yeah, do you remember that bit? And then it goes, and then Moses does a whole tour of the Mediterranean. He's like all over the shop, and eventually he comes back up the Nile, and he glides serenely towards the princess. So Jochebed trusts in the providence of God, and look where Moses ends up. That's one way of looking at these verses. Another way of looking at these verses is that what happens is that Jochebed is a smart woman. And Jochebed realizes there's this edict that's gone out that every Hebrew boy should be killed. So, where could I hide my boy in plain sight? How could I get my son under the protection of somebody who protects my boy and kind of be exempt from the rule that every Hebrew boy should die? She thinks, well, what about the princess? Because every single day she sees the princess going to bathe in the same spot. She thinks, if I plonk my boy right there, so she's basically going to trip over him when she goes swimming, maybe she'll have sympathy on him because, after all, he's a fine child. Maybe she'll have sympathy on him, and she might even want to kind of adopt him into her family, and then he'll be safe. So that's the plan. So what she does then is she rehearses with Miriam. Miriam's the older sister of Moses, yeah? So they role play. Each day they practice, and eventually it's game day. They go live. So Jochebed goes down. This is the place where the princess always goes to. She puts it right there, absolutely prime position, goes away and hides. And then, of course, the princess comes along. Oh, my goodness. Oh, tripped over a baby. Oh, wow, what a fine child. She's like looking into his eyes. Isn't he lovely? And at this point, Miriam apparently randomly wanders up and says, oh, hello. I can see you've got a baby there. Yes, isn't he a fine child? The princess says. And Miriam says, look, I don't know, but maybe he's one of those Hebrew boys. If you want, maybe I can do you a favor. I don't know if you really want the hassle of breastfeeding this boy. I could go amongst the Hebrew, I could just go and see if by chance there happens to be, like a wet nurse who's available who could help. Would that help? And the princess is like, do you know, that is a really helpful suggestion. That is exactly what I need. Well, thank you. So, are you sure? And so Miriam says, look, I can't promise anything, but I'll see what I can do. All the time she knows. This is working. This is the plan of God working. So she goes back. As soon as she turns her back, she's like, so she goes back. She doesn't just find a random Hebrew nursing mother. She goes to find her mum. She goes to find Jochebed. She's like, oh, Mum, the plan's working. Isn't God great? The providence of God, the plan of God. And Jochebed's like, yeah, I knew if we trusted God, this would work. And so now Jochebed has to act as well. So she comes along, and she's like, hello, Your Highness. And the princess is like, oh, I wonder if you can help me. I've got this baby boy. He really is a fine child. And I was just wondering, I'm looking for somebody to breastfeed. And so Jochebed's like, oh, let me have a look. I'll see what I can do. It's going to cost you. Oh, no, don't worry about that. The princess says, I'm a princess. I've got loads of money. And so they arrange a price. She's sort of bartering away, getting the best rates. And eventually they seal the deal. And of course, Jochebed gets to take her own child. And she walks back. Isn't God great? Isn't the providence and plan of God? Do you realize what's happened here? The most powerful man on earth has decreed that Moses should be killed. And yet what happens is Jochebed not only gets to save her son so that Moses lives, but she actually ends up getting paid to nurse her own son. How cool is that? God can do that for you. When it looks grim, when everything's going wrong, when it looks like an impossible situation, the power, the authority you're up against, God can break through. Just like he did here for Jochebed. Wow. What happens next? Well, he gets called Moses in chapter 10. I drew him out of the water. And one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. So don't you think we can kind of sense from that, Moses did have some awareness that he wasn't actually Egyptian by birth. Maybe he was being nursed by Jochebed for so long that she taught him and he was aware that he was Hebrew by birth. Or maybe actually the princess just told him. I said, you're adopted. You were Hebrew by birth, but we adopted you, and now you're in our family, and you're the Prince of Egypt. Maybe that's how it worked out. I don't know. But he definitely had a sense of who he was, because, can you see, he's looking this way and that, and then he takes matters into his own hands on behalf of the Hebrew people. It says here, looking this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian. Now, that's quite significant, don't you think? Because you see, if Moses really had been called by God to do this act, he wouldn't have been looking this way and that. He would have trusted God. Doesn't matter who sees what's happening here. I'm doing God's will. God will look after me. But no, we find out here, folks, this was Moses' idea. We know he hadn't prayed about this. How do we know that? Because he doesn't look up. He looks this way and that to see if the coast is clear, but he doesn't look up. And he tries to hide the body. If God had called him to do this, he wouldn't have been fussed about hiding the body. But he can't do it right. You see, it's his idea. What happens is, when he buries the body, he leaves the toes of the Egyptian sticking up out of the sand. Yeah? And so the next morning, what's happening is somebody's walking along, and they think, oh my goodness, how weird is that? I've never seen that before in my life, some human toes down. I mean, what a bizarre sight. So they kick around in the sand to think, what's the deal with the toes? There's a whole body buried here. He's been discovered. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? The man said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian? Da, da, da. Then Moses was afraid and thought, What I did must have become known. Well, of course it became known, because you only buried him in that much sand. You need at least that much sand, you're going to bury a dead body. So of course it's going to become known. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. And maybe this is where you are at in your life right now. In the wilderness, nothing seems to be happening. And actually, it did seem so promising at the start. Just think of all the trouble God went to preserve Moses' life as a baby. The great things that God must have in store for Moses. But none of them have worked out. Moses must have been able to look back and think, you know what? I used to be a prince. He went to the Oxford or Cambridge University of his day. All that education, all that training, all the contacts. If he was ever going to jumpstart a rebellion, which is what he was trying to do when he killed the Egyptian, if ever he was going to lead his people out of Egypt, back in the palace, he was so well connected, maybe he could have pulled the whole thing off, but it's all gone wrong. And now, he's in the middle of nowhere. And I just want to encourage you, if you are here this morning and you are feeling, I did think God had a plan for my life. That plan hasn't worked out. Maybe God will choose someone else, seeing as it didn't work out with me. God will kind of think, I did have great plans for you. That's why there are all those exciting promises. Do you remember when you were younger? Hasn't worked out. I think I'll choose him or her. No. This is why it's so encouraging. That's why I'm so glad you're here reading Exodus chapter 3, because as we read together, we discover that actually God has not finished with Moses, and God has not finished with you. In fact, you're not even on plan B. You are still on plan A. It's just that you don't realize it, because God couldn't have used you in the palace, but he is going to use you in the wilderness, and this is when there's a test. Oh, this is so important that you get this. The test comes in the wilderness. It's so easy in the palace when you're well connected, doing the will of God there. But in the wilderness, when you're feeling disillusioned and disheartened, this is where it matters. This is where the rubber hits the road. Why is it so hard? Because the test is so innocuous, so puny. You almost don't notice that it is a test. What's the test? Yes. There are these 7 women who are coming to water their livestock at the well. And just before they do, some shepherds nip in and they water their flock first. That's the test. Compared to leading an enslaved nation, holding the promises of God out of Egypt, out of the nose of the most powerful man on earth, that would be a massive challenge that appears to have totally gone wrong. This is really rather prosaic, don't you think? And it would have been so easy for Moses just to turn his back and say, well, there's some sort of kerfuffle going on. There's some women who, they're in an argument about something to do with who's first. We were here first. Oh, no, we were here first. He could have just walked off. And what do I care? He could have thought. And if you have seen the movie, The Prince of Egypt, then you will know that the part of Moses is voiced by Val Kilmer. And Val Kilmer is Batman. And up until this point in the story, Moses has seen himself as a sort of a Batman figure. You see, what Batman does is he sticks his nose into arguments and problems that are going on in Gotham City and kind of sticks his nose in and it's like a rescuer, yeah? That's how Moses has been operating up until now, but it's all gone wrong. But now, look, he gets it right. Do you see in verse 17, he gets it right? Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. Yeah, you passed the test. That's what's happening in your life right now. You're passing the test. And it seems so innocuous. But you've got to pass the test in the wilderness if ever you want the big thing to happen, because this is where God's put you right now in the wilderness to see if you'll pass the test or whether you'll blow it off. It's just so boring, so prosaic. But no, he doesn't. He passes the test, and it's so wonderful. Hey, let's just see what happens next in our story. The girls return to Reuel. This is tremendously confusing. This is actually Jethro, but he's also called Reuel. They return to Jethro, their father. He asks them, oh, why have you returned so early? Oh, an Egyptian. Well, actually, he's not an Egyptian. He's like culturally Egyptian. He's got an Egyptian accent, but he's not actually Egyptian. He's a Hebrew. Moses rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock. Oh, where is he? You know, this bloke who helped you out. Oh, why did you leave him? Why don't you invite him over for dinner? Jethro says. And so Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughter Zipporah. Well, that was quick. Really? Yeah. Oh my goodness. He gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Wow. And then verse 22, Zipporah gave birth to a son. Oh my goodness, that's quick as well, don't you think? And Moses named him Gershom, saying, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. Folks, that is how cheesed off Moses is. That's how fed up he is. That's how hacked off he is about life. Do you feel like that at the moment? I mean, can you imagine the scene? There's Moses on his frustration in the wilderness, you know. I used to go to this great university. I know hieroglyphics. I'm the most educated, economics, astrology. I know the whole deal. I had all these promises of God. Now I'm just like in the wilderness. And then in comes Zipporah with this baby, Moses' first boy. And she says, oh, Moses, Zipporah says, isn't he lovely? What should we call him, Moses? And Moses is like, call him, I've become a foreigner in a foreign land. Puh, that's the reply. And so Zipporah's like, oh, all right. Darling, you're going to be called Gershom. What does that mean, Mummy? It means, I've become a foreigner in a foreign land. What sort of a name's that, Mummy? Anyway, that's what happens. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery. We've heard all this before. They cry out. Yeah, they're always crying out. 400 years of crying out. Their cry for help because of slavery goes up to, it always goes up to God, but nothing ever happens. Verse 24. God heard their groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Yes, yes. Things are looking up. Maybe the band would like to come up and join me. God heard, God remembered, and verse 25, God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. How wonderful is that? You see, the thing is that when you're in the wilderness, it's so easy to give up. When it's been promised for so long and nothing's happening, you're about to give up. There's only so much defying of the elements that you can muster. And you're about to give in, and all God's plans and promises for your life don't seem to have worked out, and you're in the wilderness, and you don't know what's going on. And all of a sudden, in verse 25, God hears, God acts. And do you know what God's got in store in the very next verse? Fire. Fire in your life. Fire in the wilderness. God meets Moses in the wilderness. I'm here today to tell you, God's not going to meet you in the palace. God's going to meet you in the wilderness. That's why you're in the wilderness. Why? Because in the palace, all that stuff, in the palace, Moses thought, I've got what it takes. He wants to jumpstart a rebellion. I'm God's man of power for the hour. I'm going to pull this off. I'm going to step in. I'm going to kill the Egyptian. I'm going to sort out disputes because he thinks he can do it in his own strength. God can't use him. He needs to be in the wilderness. Because in the wilderness, all that's knocked out of him. He's got no self-confidence left, but he's available to God. Maybe you're in the wilderness so that you wouldn't be doing anything else because God can use you and God can meet you and God can meet you in the fire. Let's stand together, shall we? Let's stand. Thank you, Lord, for what you're going to do next week. Thank you, Lord, for Genesis 3 and verse 2. Thank you, Lord, for the burning bush. Thank you for that power experience in the wilderness. Human beings meeting with God. And despite all the disillusion, all the disappointment, all the unfulfilled promises, the 400 years of groaning, Lord, for your power. Let's worship, shall we? Let's sing together.
You're like like a circle that floats around me, keeping me safe and sound. And when I fall, you've tied a rope to me. You're blessing me every